Back in the days of kilts and claymores, Colonel Douglas Macgregor would have been a compatriot of mine. He's probably from the clan of Rob Roy Macgregor, who knew a thing or two about irregular guerrilla fighting. I can tell you, I have a portrait on my wall of the escape of Rob Roy at the ford when he escaped from vastly superior numbers of English redcoats. But that's another matter. Since then, Colonel Douglas Macgregor has become a retired US Army colonel. He's an author, he's a consultant on both defence and foreign policy at a very high level. And we're very lucky that he's a regular guest on the mother of all talk shows. Colonel Macgregor, thank you for joining us on such a significant evening, the evening which might turn out to be the beginning of the end of all of us. If Netanyahu attacks Iran this evening, as seems overwhelmingly likely, then Iran will respond tenfold compared to last evening, if not 100-fold, certainly vastly a greater attack than they mounted last night. Then your country, 4 weeks before a presidential election, quite likely to be dragged in. And then the balloon really goes up, doesn't it?
Well, I think the trigger for the regional war that you're talking about was really the Israeli Defense Forces invasion of southern Lebanon. You could even argue that the destruction of so much of Beirut and the killing of 7,000 people in and around Beirut in northern Lebanon has had a profound impact. But clearly, when the Israelis made the decision to go into the south, that was really the start of the regional war, because the Iranians had always taken the position that Hezbollah could take the bombardment and that they would not engage unless the Israelis went in on the ground. That's now happened. And so the Iranians have responded to the earlier provocation. And I think that in retrospect, they will regard what they did as having been a mistake. Not that they attacked, but that they were so feeble in their response, because it's going to invite, as you rightly point out, a devastating response from Israel.
Well, unless, I mean, I was a boxer once, Colonel, unless it's a rope-a-dope tactic that Ali performed on George Foreman, unless in the wake of the Israeli response, they come out all guns blazing, all left hooks swinging. But I tend to your point of view, and I put it gently to Professor Morandi, that it was performative in that it targeted only places and things that had been targeted before. When the performance of the missiles was so spectacularly successful, they could have taken out a lot more things than they did, but they deliberately did not do so. Why do you think they made that calculation?
Well, there are two reasons for that, George. The first is that you have a new government in Tehran that is actually, by the standards of the past, very, very moderate. And the new president of Iran has made it very clear that he wants a new relationship with the United States, that he was hoping to develop a new rapport with the West. He obviously wants to get out from under financial sanctions, but most important, wants to get out of this straitjacket of hostility that we live in. And I say the United States and Iran. So I think that was one reason. He wasn't interested in provoking the Israelis any further. The second part of it is that I think both President Putin and President Xi have urged not only the government in Tehran, but all the governments in the region to exercise restraint. I think finally they decided they had to respond to the earlier provocation, but that's why it was so modest in scale. And as you point out, killed, I think, only one Israeli citizen, which of course is by design. That's not what they wanted to do. I think they wanted to demonstrate their capability for precision strike. The problem is that, as I pointed out earlier, from the Israeli standpoint, it was feeble. And the Israelis do not believe in symmetrical warfare. They're big believers in asymmetry. and they will strike back with a serious vengeance. And I expect that, as you point out, the Iranians will respond. Hezbollah is already doing very serious damage to the Israeli ground force moving into their country. The defense minister spoke publicly and tried to explain to the population the heavy losses were unavoidable because this was the cost of the most justified war in their history. And again, you got to go back to Netanyahu and remember, he said, I'm going to utterly annihilate Hamas and drive the population of Gaza out or kill it or both. I'm going to also eventually do the same to the West Bank. I'm going to defeat and eliminate Hezbollah. We're going to crush the Shiite militias in Iraq. We'll destroy the Houthis. And ultimately, we will destroy Iran, which is the ultimate evil incarnate that is plaguing us. And for this purpose, we have assigned ourselves the mission in the U.S. Armed Forces to stand ready to support Mr. Netanyahu in this rather rapidly widening regional conflict.
Well, that's what we used to call, when you and I were younger, the $64,000 question, when $64,000 was worth a lot more than it is now. Why?
Yes.
Why 4 weeks before a presidential election would the United States embroil itself in all-out war in the Persian Gulf, after which no oil, no gas, no ships will travel? You won't be able to pay $10 a gallon for petrol because you won't be able to get any. Nothing will move through the Red Sea, through the Straits of Hormuz. Why? That's the big question, isn't it?
Well, I think we can answer it. Two reasons. One is Mr. Netanyahu knows that right now he has more control and influence over what the United States government does than anybody in the government. We are unconditionally supportive of whatever he wants to do. Now, this is not a function of American public opinion. There has been no debate. There's nothing constitutional about our actions. This is simply the product of the strength and the power of the Israel lobby. And the Israel lobby at this stage controls both parties. So we have to assume that it doesn't make a great deal of difference who wins the election. If you're living in the Middle East, the Israelis are going to continue to enjoy the kind of support that they've got right now. And contrary to whatever President Biden and his administration says, they have fundamentally enabled the Israelis all the way along. There has been no serious opposition, no obstacles in the way of Israeli action. So the only thing that we can say at this point is that Hezbollah is putting up very stiff resistance, and the Israelis are going to take hard casualties trying to fight their way through that. We can also say what you've said, which is that Iran will respond dramatically to whatever the Israelis now do. Now, what will the Israelis do? Well, they're going to destroy, I suspect, the oil production facilities in Iran. They will also try to decapitate the government. And that is also something that they depend very heavily on from us, because we're the ones with the highly skilled and sophisticated ISR capabilities that allow us to find people like Nasrallah and others so that the Israelis can target and kill them. And then finally, I'm sure that the Israelis will go after the so-called nuclear development facilities, the places where the centrifuges exist, and our friends, the Iranians, have been trying to build a nuclear weapon. At least that's the allegation. So I think that will all happen. Now, the Iranians have already said, and I'm saying now the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has said that if you destroy Iran's oil facilities, its production facilities, that they're going to put the torch to just about everything else in the region connected to oil, which means that your prediction of serious economic consequences and financial Armageddon are entirely justified. You are spot on. That is going to happen. Then the question is, what does Russia do? Russia has invested very heavily to help the Iranians build up their air and missile defense capability. How effective will that be against the Israelis? We'll see. We have to assume it will have some effect. Will it be enough? We don't know yet. We'll have to wait and see. And I think the Chinese are absolutely apoplectic right now, because the last thing they want to see happen is the Straits of Hormuz close, because they're heavily dependent on all of that oil and gas that comes from there through the Strait of Malacca and then up through the South China Sea. So you're going to have Chinese and Russian interest in this. And ultimately, I think the entire Shanghai Cooperation Council, along with this thing that we call BRICS, all of it will side with Iran against us. And I mean Israel and the United States.
So riveting, indeed dazzling, was that summary. I'm loath to move you to another theatre of conflict, but I feel I must. The bowling over of the remaining resistance of the Zelensky crew in Ukraine seems to me, you know far more than I, seems to me to be really rapidly picking up pace. I have a feeling that as we once said about other conflicts, it'll all be over by Christmas. I have a feeling that the Russians are on a roll in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian armed forces aren't actually in much of a mood to continue resisting it. What's your take?
No, I think you're right. Of course, the whole idea of terminating this conflict is something that Washington refuses to participate in. That's the one thing that could change if you ended up with President Trump. I think he would move to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine. But otherwise, I think you're right. The Russians have fired so many Iskander missiles. These are medium-range ballistic missiles to destroy all of the Army tactical missile systems, HIMARS, rocket artillery systems that we've given to the Ukrainians, that those systems have largely vanished from the battlefield. The front lines are crumbling, and the last areas of resistance have been subjected to attack with 6,000 and 9,000 pound fuel air explosive bombs. So I think the decision in Moscow is very clear. They've had it. They're tired of this nonsense. They want to end it. They have been trying vainly to find a negotiating partner. That partner hasn't shown up. So I think they're going to move decisively to the river. I would not be surprised to see them enter Kiev, because they know that unless they take those kinds of actions, this will not end. They'll end up dealing with some sort of resurgent, insurgent enemy in Western Ukraine, which, of course, they don't want. No one in their right mind would want it. And I know the people who are living in Western Ukraine don't want it. But that's the sort of idea that lingers in Washington, D.C., and I think where you are in London.
I'm with you entirely in that analysis. So let me go on finally to something on which we may differ. It's only, 50 days less to the presidential election. Who's going to win? And where will it make any difference who wins?
Well, you know, I have many attributes, but I am not a prophet. So I'm reluctant to say one way or the other. I think much is going to depend on the quality of the election itself. You know, we have a huge problem with ballot fraud, with all the absentee ballots that come flowing in. We have a bad habit of taking the motor voter registration. These are the automobile registrants and driver's licenses, and treating them as all as evidence for citizenship, when in fact that's not the case. We have a problem with online voting. How do you secure that? People insist it's secure, but there are questions. And then we're going to have to see who actually shows up. Now, my personal suspicion is that there isn't much enthusiasm out there for Vice President Harris. If there is, I haven't seen it, and I live on the East Coast. And I have lots of friends who are Democrats, and they tell me privately, there's no enthusiasm out there for this woman, none. So if things are reasonably clean in terms of the voting, I think President Trump will return to the White House. Now, of course, that assumes that President Trump makes his way through the election to the White House and someone doesn't successfully kill the man, because I don't think we've seen the end of that either.
I agree. It's remarkable how little attention there is to the fact that the most likely next president and the immediate past president has had two attempts on his life. He appears to believe that these threats to his life come from Iran. He cannot possibly be stupid enough to believe that, Colonel. It's the American deep state that's trying to kill Donald Trump, don't you think?
Well, I certainly agree with your first point, which is the Iranians have had nothing to do with this. There's simply no tangible, concrete evidence for that at all. Now, is it the deep state? Is it, well-financed minorities, corporate interests? I mean, this is a barrel of eels. There are all sorts of characters in there with an agenda that could be part of this, but clearly it is not Iran. It may be that the so-called deep state that you're mentioning, the swamp, as some people call it, is trying to prepare the American people for war with Iran. And so it's convenient to say, again, all evil stems from Iran. But that's nonsense. And I don't think most Americans privately buy that argument in the least.
Colonel Macgregor, I salute you. Thank you very much for another dazzling display on the mother of all talk shows. I'll tell you, the quality of guests on this show is off the charts.